thank you everybody for coming. It's really great to see all of you or hear you hopefully soon. Just to open up quickly, I'm Corinna Lotz, and I'm a participant and a helper and activist in the Real Democracy movement, as well as a blogger and writer. And I've been given the job of moderating this. This is a collaboration, or actually no, the second collaboration between the Real Democracy movement and sorry, let me get this straight. It's actually the first collaboration with the Real Democracy movement and the Museum of Care, which follows on an earlier collaboration, which was mentioned in the call out for this meeting. But yeah, we have this collaboration largely thanks to Mark Fuller, who's with us, who really brought us together. And we decided to have at least two discussions, and this is the first of them, about the nature of the state. And there'll be a second one in November, which we'll let you know about later. But for tonight's event, which is going to last only 1 hour, we're thanking also Nika, who can't be with us because she's in China and can't connect properly. But anyway, this is being recorded, as you probably realize, so we can share it with other people later on. So tonight we've got an introduction by Paul Feldman, who is an activist, a journalist, editor, and author who's written a book called Unmasking the State, which maybe Paul can stick it in the chat for people, so you can look it up. It's available online and can be read as a PDF. So he's been very active in recent years, helping to organize people's, citizens, and popular assemblies in London and other parts of the UK, and he'll hopefully bring some of that experience into tonight's discussion. To help with the discussion from the Museum of Care side is Mark Fuller, who describes himself as a housekeeper in the Museum of Care, and he's going to touch on David Graeber's ideas and connect them up with the discussion that we're having tonight. So the order is going to be, first Paul will speak for 15 minutes, there'll be a discussion after that, and then Mark will come in and try and bring in some of the discussions that have been held around David's ideas. And so please, when Paul's finished, make sure you raise your hand. It's the best way of letting me know that you wish to speak. And Penny's going to help me make sure that I don't miss anybody out. And then after that, Mark will come in. So we'll have that's basically the plan for the meeting. So hope that's pretty clear. And I'll hand over to Paul.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's good. So thanks for the invite and for the collaboration. It's a very important discussion we're about to embark upon. So I want to set out to try and explain three aspects of this state question. So what do I mean by the state? Then the interdependence of capitalism and the present state, and the significance of the state question for activists. So first of all, what is the state? And if I can do this in 15 minutes, it'd be brilliant, but I'll try. So clearly, state forms vary from country to country. So I'm dealing with the general form of the state that prevails in the major capitalist countries like the UK, the US, France, and so on. They are generally given the label of representative or parliamentary democracies. I actually prefer the term bourgeois democracies, but we'll come back to that. These states are all under tremendous stress, as you know, and that's a matter for a future session. So to start with, I like the summary definition by the Marxist sociologist Bob Jessup as a starting point. I think Corinna going to try and put this on the screen because it's a bit of a dense summary. So he says the core of the state apparatus comprises a relatively unified ensemble of socially embedded, socially regularized, institutions and organizations whose socially accepted function is to define and enforce collectively binding decisions in the name of the common interest of an imagined political community identified with that territory. And leave that up for a little while. It wants looking at. Let's unpack that. So the UK state apparatus, we could include in that political institutions like government and parliament, enforcement agencies like the courts, the police and the armed forces, symbolic institutions like the monarchy, the administrative arm in the shape of the civil service, the spy agencies like MI5 and so on. What Jessup is saying, and I agree, that the state defines and enforces binding decisions and has a monopoly on the use of violence. So the state is where power is situated. Through its actors, the state has the power to rule over us, and this power is socially accepted and embedded in society. The state rules in the common interest, which is more imagined than real. It's an ensemble of institutions and organizations which are relatively unified, only relatively because they are often in conflict with each other as well as with society as a whole. We think of Parliament and its conflict with the courts, the police and their disagreements, and the conflict and the tension with government. So moving on. So I think the state as a whole has a life of its own, an enduring presence. As the theorists Colin Hay and Michael Lister say, while governments come and go, the state as an institutional ensemble persists as it evolves over time. So it has this kind of existence in and out, whether governments are in or out, it still exists, the state still exists. I think this is a very important point. Some other features of the state are significant in my view. The state is separated institutionally from wider society. It is operationally autonomous. In other words, it is alienated from us and sits above society while being part of it. We don't control the state. The state has the power and authority to control us. Or we may not recognize the state, but the state certainly recognizes us. What is also important to note from Jessup's definition is the question of social acceptance. All states require this affirmation on a continuous basis. Their legitimacy and authority require it. Elections can be seen as one way of reinforcing this acceptance, for example. This point is also made by the Australian historian and theorist Graham Gill. He says, to the extent, if you can put this one up, Corinna, too, to the extent that the state can be said to have an essence, it is the continuing projection of public power in the pursuit, that's the one, in the pursuit of its aims. It does this in a particular territory through acceptance of its sovereignty, its bureaucratic structure, and the monopoly of coercion. Jessup and his co-thinkers see the state as an institutionalized social and class compromise, requiring, but not always providing, concessions to the population at large and visions that can help secure social acceptance. So moving on to the second question, before I look at how activists should engage with the state, let's move on from what we have established so far and see how the state and capitalism relate to each other and are interdependent. And this is each day in thousands of ways, the state interacts with business, financial, and commercial interests. The nature of this role has changed throughout history. From the laissez-faire of the early 19th century to promoting imperialism, to regulation and the welfare state after 1945, and today a seeming return to a 21st century of laissez-faire, also known as neoliberalism. Historically, in the UK, the state created the framework for the development of capitalism. For example, the legalization of joint stock ownership of banks was made in 1826. Then in 1855 and 1856, new laws introduced limited liability for shareholders and extended joint stock ownership to industrial enterprises. Shareholder ownership of corporations, land, finance, and other resources is backed by common and statute law and enforced by the courts as well as by the police. So too is ownership of what is produced in terms of goods and services. A worker is free to labor for an agreed wage, but has no legal claim on what is produced or any profits that may result from her work. So the supply of relatively educated and healthy workers, which is required by the capitalists, is achieved by the state. Other functions that capitalists as a class cannot perform are also undertaken by the state. For example, the building of transport and energy infrastructure and state projects, even if today they are privately financed. As you know, market failures are a regular occurrence for capitalism. The state will step in and take action on behalf of the system as a whole. During the 2008 financial crash, the state bailed out and nationalized some banks, while others were allowed to go to the war. During the COVID pandemic, the state bailed out whole sectors of industry by paying their workers and by other measures. In the neoliberal period, which we're living in, the state deregulated the financial industry in line with the emergence of global money markets. And as we know, whole areas of public services have been outsourced or privatized to give the capitalist class access to new markets. And marketization extends to cultural goods, education, and health in virtually every major economy. All these activities and frameworks go towards reproducing the existing social relations that underpin capitalism. So the state apparatus feeds back into society its contribution to the regeneration of existing class relations that formed it in the first place. It reproduces these relations, these social relations, for succeeding generations. They add to a general sense of permanence that there is no alternative. I think this is important that, people are born into this state with its existing ideologies, with the existing frameworks, and in this way, the state reproduces the relations of capitalism. That's a very important function that it performs. Going further, and the dependence on the state on capitalism itself. So the UK state is dependent on economic activity, and above all, having people in work paying taxes and spending money as consumers. The bulk of that employment is provided by the private sector, by capitalist enterprises. So the state, whatever government is in power, is committed to creating the conditions for the private sector to flourish. And not just to flourish, but for economic activity to grow year on year. As the American labor economist Martin Carnoy notes, economic activity produces state revenues, and public support for a regime will decline unless accumulation continues to take place. State managers willingly do what they know they must to facilitate capital accumulation. Finally, the state is utterly reliant on financial markets for borrowing to cover spending shortfalls or national emergencies. Naturally, these loans attach interest, which will be paid out of taxed income. So capitalism and the present state are in a deep, mutual, if often troubled embrace. Their fates are co-determined. Which brings me to my, final aspect of this question. What is the significance of the state question for activists? I think I should say at the outset, this question is seldom considered because the assumption is, I think the state is a neutral body that can be bent to popular will and implement fundamental change. Whereas I see it, and others see it as a barrier to human progress in tackling, for example, the climate crisis or gross inequality. So many protests and actions are directed against the status quo and are directed at influencing state action. Other activists will advocate a kind of bypassing of the state by building alternatives and seeing if they can compete with the state in this way. But I've tried to show in a condensed form how the state is tied to capitalism. It is a capitalist type of state. Therefore, its actions are limited and constrained by that social relationship. For example, serious action on climate change would have to abandon economic growth as a policy, eliminate fossil fuel use, and the destruction of habitat. A capitalist state cannot possibly do that because it would fundamentally alter the nature of the profit-based economy. So in my last few points, and I should do this within my 15 minutes of allotted time. So in my view, the challenge is to bring out the nature of the state for activists while developing democratic alternatives that give content to the call for power to the people. This approach is crucial if we aspire to a non-hierarchical society where citizens, perhaps through a network of assemblies or similar, have direct access to power in their communities, towns, cities, and workplaces. In any case, there's plenty of evidence that representative democracy is past its use-by date and that dictatorship and authoritarian rule is replacing it. A state without a state is possible. The withering away of the state is what we aim for. The first step on that road, in my view, is a perspective that embraces dissolving the present capitalist state as a political power that oppresses society. Finally, as Jessup writes, I don't know if you've got this one, Corinna, all forms of social power linked to class domination are fragile, unstable, provisional, and temporary, and that continuing struggles are needed to secure class domination, overcome resistance, and naturalize or mystify class power. So this fragility, instability, this temporality, this temporary nature of this kind of state is what we should focus on. And that is briefly the state we're in. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. We're actually a couple of minutes early here, which means we've got more time for discussion. So would anybody and everybody's invited to contribute or raise a question by raising your hand would be very helpful. A lot to think about there. Does anybody want me to put the last image back up or just look at our faces?
Okay, I'll kick off. Is it possible that there could ever be, without the withering away of the state, a state that is truly socialist or communistic in nature? Or is, I mean, have this, I don't know, the USSR obviously is the only example we really have, China possibly. And I mean, they weren't exactly very benevolent sorts of places. But is there a possibility that there could be a truly socialist state? Or what about those kind of maverick states like North Korea, for instance? Where would you place somewhere like that?
Paul, do you want to take the questions together, or do you want to take them one by one? Because we've got a second question now as well.
Other people can reply to them as well as me. So
yeah.
Okay, I'll take another one. Thank you.
Okay, Rahila wants to speak.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about it from the perspective of Southall Black Sisters. So we have a particular relationship with the state, which is, I mean, it's both problematic and sort of helpful. So if we take, for example, some of the issues that we've been fighting on for the last 40 years or so, if you take the issue, let's say, of forced marriage, we look to the state for legislation, support, financial resources, etc., in order to deal with this issue, because we cannot look to our communities to support us in that. But we also know that the state will often respond, for example, to the issue of forced marriage, since I'm talking about that, with draconian immigration legislation, because that's their agenda. So we're kind of in this situation where a contradiction, obviously, where we need the state, but we also know that the state will always respond with a certain level of oppression. So we are constantly fighting that, and we might be one step forward and then two steps back in the way in which the state responds. It's a really difficult, as an aspiration and as a as some sort of utopia, we might look at the possibility of society without a state. Like in Rojava, I think Rojava in northeast Syria is a very good example. And I think I look forward to what Mark Fuller has to say about David Graeber's thoughts around a non-state society. But but where we are now, until we have the end of capitalism, we're kind of stuck with this damn state, and we need it and we hate it, but we've got to work with it as well.
Thank you, Rahila. Christian has also got a question or a point, maybe.
More of a question. Thank you. I found the introduction very interesting, but I'm kind of wondering to what degree the state or states are like the still matter, you know, because quite a bit of international governance has moved to transnational bodies like the IMF, WTO, and so on. And just as an example, if I recall correctly, Australia is being sued by the tobacco industry in the WTO because they wanted to, you know, prohibit advertising of tobacco products, something like that. And there's a few other cases like this where being a state doesn't really matter. I mean, being a state matters, I guess, in maybe a few cases only. The US, China, maybe Russia, I don't know. Europe doesn't seem to matter much anymore. And, you know, the global South, probably not much either. I mean, maybe as a local replication mechanism for like keeping up the class structure. But it seems like the decisions are made, you know, power moved to the corporate level, and the corporates are international. So that was a long thing, sorry. What do you think about that?
Thanks, Christian. Paul, maybe you could answer now because nobody else has got their hand up.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll try anyway. I mean, Fiona's question about whether there can be a truly democratic socialist communist state in advance of the withering away of the state. I think that's what you said, Fiona. I think it's a problematic because as soon as you have a state, you have this alienation. A state presupposes an alienated power. So I would say that the answer to your question is probably no. But unless that state has to be consciously in transition to dissolving itself into communities, into workplaces. That was the original idea in Russia. But as we know, it became bureaucratized. The Soviets lost their control, and you had a kind of party state duopoly there, and it never happened. It became bureaucratized. So it is a challenge, but the state that obviously there has to be a transition. You can't go straight to a no state, in my view. You would have to have what you're talking about, Fiona, but there has to be consciously working towards dissolving itself and dissolving its power into communities, into working class, into communities, workplaces, towns, you know, dissolving itself as a process and consciously doing that and encouraging the withering away of this alienating structure. So I think it would only be a beginning, and it would have to be consciously working towards the other of itself, if you see what I mean. And if it doesn't, then it will become a fixture and it will assume power over other people, just like the capitalist states do. Yeah. That would be my answer to that one. Rahila, I understand this conflict. You know, there are many, the whole sector in society which is dependent on the state, in the voluntary sector, the third sector, dependent on the state for resources at local or national level. And as a result, often can't set their own agendas. They are required to do what the funders say they should do, and they're constantly scrabbling around for money and resources and all the rest of it. I think this is a kind of this is a low level, not a low level for you. This is a conflict, and this is the conflict that people are enduring every day in different forms. The worker who is, working overtime without pay, the organization that's struggling for state resources and sees it as a love-hate relationship, and so on. The people who can't get to work because there's no transport system. All these kind of daily conflicts are part of this whole, system where you just don't have any control and you have no direct access to power. You have representatives who are remote, and representative democracy is kind of created to form this barrier between people and power. It gives them very limited access to power. Christian's question about, is the state relevant anymore? I think the state is relevant because these organizations that you talk of, the WTO, the IMF, were created by states, and they are financed by states too. So it's not that the state has disappeared and other organizations have taken over. I think the form of the state has changed in this period, no doubt about it, and become more of a facilitator, direct facilitator of globalization and corporate-led globalization. But without the state, there would have been no deregulation of finance, for example. It was the state and Clinton and Thatcher in this country and Blair who, enabled the financialization process to take place by scrapping laws and regulations and opening up the banks as investment banks, and then finally enabling the system to come crashing down. So I think the state is there. The state, as you say, maintains the social relations in each country, which are important for this neoliberal economy to flourish. It's got to have this local state enforcing this social framework. Otherwise, it's meaningless. So it's a relationship between the global and the local, in my view. That's it. Thank you, Corinna.
Bob, do you want to put your point, Bob, or do you want it read out? You're muted, Bob.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, if we think of the state as the structure of decision making, it's the form of that structure and the makeup of the elements of it that we need to change. The current situation is not only objectionable and unsupportive of the people it claims to represent, but excludes us, the citizens, from that decision-making structure. Now, I think what we need are things like citizens' assemblies, where we, the people, we may not agree with all of the decisions, but we don't anyway. We disagree with most of them at the moment. But if we're going to have proper democracy, rule by the people, for the people, then we need something more like citizens' assemblies, making those decisions for the people they really live with and are part of. And that can be, for example, local decisions made, decision made at a local level. Now, who these people should be, the question for me is whether it's everyone. There are big problems, I think, with things like having a referendum on everything, as they do in some of the parts of Switzerland. Another possibility is to have something like a sortition system, whereby the representatives are in some way proportionally representative of the area they are making decisions about. And these would be people who were regularly replaced by others in that same system. It's not a perfect system. I don't think anything ever is, but at least it would bring about the people making decisions on behalf of the people, rather than an elite group, as they really are now, making decisions on behalf of the rest of us. And the other point I'd make is that I sit on the Trade Justice Scotland Coalition, and we're seeing increasingly trade deals produced by governments which allow capitalist bodies, mainly multinational companies, to take over the democracy, such as it is, in countries, whereby they can sue countries which take decisions which will or may affect their profits. Now, that is the end of democracy. We really need to have more in the way of people power.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Bob. Thank you very much, Bob. I think, unless there's a burning question right now because we have some newcomers to the meeting as well, it would be very nice to hand over to Mark. But there's time for one more point if anybody wants to make one. Or 2 points even. or if not, Mark, would you want to bring in your thoughts here? You need to unmute. Just for those who were a bit late, Mark is a co-housekeeper in the Museum of Care, and he's going to bring in some of the discussions of this topic in relation to David Graeber's work.
Thank you, Corinna. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I hope this is not going to be too evident in a way, but this will be from the angle of anthropology, obviously. And so we'll be looking at the state, and I'm sort of sticking to the documents that Michael had suggested for reading beforehand, but it doesn't have to be restricted to that. And so fragments, and I'll try to put up the books I'm referring to in the chat. Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology is one of the first books, I think, well, 2004, maybe the second book that David Graeber wrote. And in it, he's suggesting an anarchist social theory as an academic discipline. And he says that anarchism, and a lot of this will be, actually, you should hear quotes around everything that's eloquent, and that would be his words. What anarchism needs is a low theory, a way of grappling with those real immediate questions that emerge from a transformative project. So the fragments are a proposal for an anarchist social theory, and there are just a couple of initial assumptions he says we should make. One is that another world is possible, and two, any anarchist social theory would have to reject self-consciously any trace of vanguardism. Anthropology's practice of ethnography provides a good model of how non-vanguardist revolutionary intellectual practice might work. To look at those who are creating viable alternatives, try to figure out what might be the larger implications of what they are already doing, and then offer these ideas back, not as prescriptions, but as contributions, possibilities, as gifts. And an important point to be making with the anthropology is that we need to be breaking walls in time and space. So our culture versus other cultures. What is modern? What is primitive? Societies based on kinship systems actually include us. If we look at race, class, gender, they comprise a classic clan system, except on a global scale. An obvious area this new anthropology would want to explore is the theory of the state. States are at the same time forms of institutionalized raiding or extortion and utopian projects. Compare relevant ideals of rulership and the mechanics of rule, what is purported and what actually happens. In his book Debt, which came out in 2011, he has this interdisciplinary analysis that revealed our moral confusion surrounding money and debt. And the modern state helps bring money into being, enforcing policy and debt, taxing to maintain armies, As a consequence, markets are then brought into existence, but as a side effect. And this is contrary to the Chicago Boys' economic philosophy. And then back to fragments, another related project when we're talking about the theory of state would be if many political entities we are used to seeing as states, at least in any Weberian sense, are not, then what are they? And what does that imply about political possibilities? These give rise to questions of real globalization, elimination of borders, citizenship outside the state, and of a new, maybe second form of internationalism. It's not just consensus process. The idea of mass nonviolent direct action first developed in South Africa and India. The current network model was first proposed by rebels in Chiapas. Even the notion of the affinity group came out of Spain and Latin America. The fruits of ethnography and the techniques of ethnography could be enormously helpful here if anthropologists can get past their own often squalid colonial history and come to see what they are sitting on, not as some guilty secret, but as the common property of humankind. And then I think illustrating best the sorts of tools that both David Graeber and David Wengrow are producing in their Dawn of Everything book. We were focusing on chapter 10, which was the state never had an origin. Why the state has no origin is the title of that one. And as Steve Batchelor had pointed out, that this is actually almost a book in itself. There's so much in here. After providing examples of near states or early states in the past, the Davids write, in terms of the specific theory of state or state formation we've been developing here, where they have three elementary forms of domination: control of violence, control of knowledge, and charismatic power, can each crystallize into its own institutional form: sovereignty, administration, and heroic politics. Almost all these early states, quote unquote, could be more accurately described as second order regimes of domination. First order regimes like the Olmec, Chavin, or Natchez each developed only one part of that triad of three principles. But in the typically far more violent arrangements of second order regimes, two of the three principles of domination were brought together in some spectacular, unprecedented way. For example, Egypt's early rulers had sovereignty and administration of the two of the three principles brought together. What seems to have happened in the second order regimes is that two of the principles crystallized into institutional forms, fusing in such a way as to reinforce one another as the basis of government, while the third form of domination was largely pushed out of the realm of human affairs altogether and displaced onto the non-human cosmos. So think of the classic Maya. Their cosmic bureaucracy was like a spreadsheet for a calendar of the gods. Each of the three principles of domination typically has different origins, both in space and time. So there was no long evolutionary development of the state. What we now regard as states turn out not to be a constant of history at all. So this has been brought up. The indigenous Sioux and their buffalo hunting season, that was a state during only one part of the year, and there are other examples that the Davids give. Modern states are simply one way in which the three principles of domination happen to come together, but this time with a notion for the modern state that the power of kings is held by an entity called the people, that bureaucracies exist for the benefit of said people, and in which a variation on old aristocratic contests and prizes has come to be relabeled as democracy, most often in the form of national elections. There was nothing inevitable about it. If proof of that were required, we need only observe, as Christian was pointing out, how much this particular arrangement is currently coming apart. As we noted, there are now planetary bureaucracies without anything that resembles a corresponding principle of global sovereignty or global field of competitive politics. And everything from cryptocurrencies to private security agencies are undermining the sovereignty of states. We can now see that civilization and state, both in quotes, conjoined entities that have come down to us as a historical package, refer to complex amalgams of elements which have entirely different origins and which are currently in the process of drifting apart. Seen this way, to rethink the basic premises of social evolution is to rethink the very idea of politics itself. And I just want to add that these sorts of tools that both Davids and David Graeber have given us are really primarily ways of dismantling the mythologies that we've been fed. They show the spaces in between. Beyond academics, David Graeber's work gives us hope in its questions, revealing that the present world is not inevitable. In his 2009 Direct Action book, which was an ethnography of political action, he convinces us that we don't always know what we're thinking and where we will go. He keeps the doors of our imagination open. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we've got another 10 minutes left or so. So anybody want to come in on that? Penny, would you like to speak?
You need to unmute, Penny.
You're muted, Penny.
Muted.
I understand, sorry. I think what Mark's saying about the extent to which the dawn of everything exposes this reality that of the diversity of structures through which human beings have socially organized, and also that there is this non-inevitability about it. I think that's an extremely powerful, as Mark says, tool for thinking about the current state that we live in. It's helpful, but it's not definitive, because at the end of the day, of course, the state we have to deal with is the state we're in. Mm-hmm. But it does open up some doors and windows to some ideas of the impermanence of state structures and differing forms of social organization. And I think that's really important because of the way in which we are, the hegemony is able to educate us generation on generation of the permanence of capitalism. And I also think what Rahila was saying adds to this, because of course what she said underlined this reality that the state is a contradiction. There's a contradiction within the state. We do have rights, there are laws, and we participated, of course, in enormous struggle in getting those rights. They didn't come naturally out of the state structures. They were wrested from the state structures. And that contradiction, you know, is really the most important thing. And I'm just going to stick in the chat box a little quote which I really like, which is from Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. He says,
Can you speak up a little bit? You're a bit faint there.
Says the tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain of reaction which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. from a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. I think those are the moments, you know, that really for us are absolutely crucial, and that arise out of the deepening of these contradictions that exist within the state itself. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Penny. Michael want to speak next, and after that, Christian.
Yeah, so I just say that's a great kind of presentation, Mark. It one of the things that it points to is there's a lot of similarities in the way David Graeber talks about the state, as in here is this kind of social justification of the state by a group of quite elites, but there's also this, what are the actual mechanics of it? And I think that, and there's all kinds of different forms in that. On the other hand, he's also saying how many that this kind of frame that we have is there is no alternative. It's just the state. And I think we have to be careful about talking about the state kind of naturalizes itself. And so we have to be careful about talking about that. And this is one of the things that David Graeber seems to be very good at, is saying, like, giving examples of places where people didn't really imagine the state, because the state isn't always there, isn't always around. It kind of pretends to be more than it really is. And if we buy into or believe that, then we kind of get drawn into that. So many types of consensus process, many types of local decision-making. And there's also throughout history been very organized forms of intercultural decision-making, large geography decision-making that weren't really quite like the state as we have it now. So I think those are things. Traditionally in revolutions, people have organized dual power. They just ignored the state and started doing their own thing. You know, oftentimes they ignored one state to create another state because they couldn't successfully imagine themselves out of a state. But I think some of the stuff that Paul talks about in the beginning is really useful for people saying, how do we really understand the state? Because people will say, what do we do politics? Oh, let's vote for the right politicians to get the thing. It doesn't really matter what politicians you get, because the state is a structure that does the same thing all the time. So being able to imagine it not there, or being able to imagine it's not as powerful as it claims, is really quite useful, And the tradition in the syndicalist phrase is building the new society within the structures of the old. So you just get going, you start, you do your stuff, and then you'll have to remember you're going to come into confrontation sometime with the state if they find threatening what you're doing. So those are kind of maybe some of the ways to think about this. I would also pitch the reading, because we attached to the registering a link to some of the readings of this, and it had a reading of Paul, reading of Bob Jessup, and a little bit of David Graeber's. 1 month from now, we're going to do it again, and it has lots of more reading on democracy. And I think that has already been brought up, but we see how how different forms of different images of what democracy are might be useful in also in thinking about how we just step past the state.
Thank you, Michael. That's very, very helpful. Just to say, Christian's waiting and Rahila's next. And after that, Paul and Mark might want to just say a couple of words each, but we've only got less than 8 or 9 minutes, so please be very brief. Thank you. So Christian, over to you.
Thank you. I have a bit of a mixed emotions about that, like especially about the part about dismantling mythologies. And I really like David Graeber's work, or I wouldn't be here. And I completely agree with him being able to point out positive examples. But we've had one example of mythologies coming apart in our lifetime. That was the Soviet Union, when the elites of the Soviet Union ceased to believe in their own myth and more or less gave it away, and the whole thing fell apart, and it fell apart rather bloodily. And we might be seeing something like this currently again if you look at the US, where the American dream is basically dead. And this seems to be not controversial for quite a lot of people these days. You know, you never know if it's going to come true or not, but you know, that might also be happening. And if we look at the Soviet Union, that doesn't imply that things are going to get better, which brings me to my last point. I've been wrestling with this for quite some time, and like maybe 1 year or 2 years ago, I came to the realization there is no left anymore, at least not as a political or organizational force. I mean, there's people who do organize, there's people who are activists, and I respect everybody who's doing anything because most people do nothing. But I think currently the big problem is there's nothing beyond the resurgence of nationalism on an organizational level. And I wonder if anybody has something to say to oppose this point of view.
So, shall I go?
Yes, Raila.
Actually, Christian, I think I do have something to say which is more hopeful. And I want to talk briefly about the revolution that is taking place in northeast Syria, in a place called Rojava. Maybe people have heard about it, and I don't need to go into great detail, but it is attempting to be a grassroots democracy, a stateless democracy. And I was particularly interested in it because all my kind of activist life, I've looked to finding a way of getting more from the state in a positive way, and wondering how one can do without the state. And I think the issue in Rojava is about a question of power, and so you do need the sort of administrative functions of the state, because when I was talking to somebody over there who was running one of the cantons, she said, you know, if we're looking at how we make sure that our resources in terms of fuel are distributed across all the regions and all the areas, you need a body that kind of coordinates all of that. But it's a question of where the power lies, and the people who are organizing from the grassroots level feel that they can hold the state accountable. Now, it will be, I'm not sure to what extent they are successful in holding the state accountable. You know, Rojava has been at war, and being at war means that you need a kind of centralized authority that takes decisions around defense. It was at war with ISIS, and then now it's at war with Turkey. Turkey's occupying vast sections of it. But the whole attempt is that the state would be simply an overarching coordinating body, but the power to challenge and to hold it to account would be with the masses, with the public. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Rahila. I'll just hand over to Paul for very brief closing remarks, and then we'll just announce the next event. And also, before Paul speaks, if you would like to know about the next event, please do put your email in the chat, and then we can send you the information. Thank you.
I'll be very brief, and it's very fruitful, very important discussion, this, because there is this crisis of the state, which others have touched upon. In the United States, it's very more profound than many other countries, with the breakdown of the political process there, stalemate, and so on, and the election of an election denier as a Speaker of the House of Representatives. So it's some crisis. I think it's important to see this in historical context. The states do come and they go. They do grow and they do flounder, and they do have an end game. They're historical structures which are not permanent. And I think that's a very important point that's come out of this discussion. And this social compromise that Jessup talks of, that Penny talked about in terms of the rights that we have won, are part of the social compromise which the state has been, the post-war state anyway, has been based on. That compromise has come to an end, in my view. So all is up now. New visions, new prospects, going beyond this state, extensions of democracy, new stage in the struggle for democracy. All this is now very, very possible. As David Graeber said, another world is possible. It really is now. And so we look around, it seems horrific, but it's the breakdown of the old which we're living through now. But the new has yet to be born, as Gramsci would say. It's there. The morbid symptoms are there. We now have to create this new. I think that's all I'd like to say.
Thank you, Paul. I'd just like to alert you all to the chat because Paul's book details are on there, and also the comment from Alistair about this legality of globalization. Well, that's just a rough summary, but please do look at the chat. And I think Mark or Michael would just like to announce about our next event. If one of you like to just touch on that. You're both muted.
I mean, obviously, so the next one is about democracy, and there's a speaker coming in to talk about what happened in Chile, which is a big discussion, that there was a huge democratic, somewhat careful process that developed some things that people agreed with in terms of doing constitutional change. So it's kind of classical lefty discussion, but it didn't necessarily work. And so this speaker is going to talk quite a bit about what they think happened. And then there's also some readings from David Graeber on democracy. And it also works very well. If you haven't already read the stuff that we put here, that Paul wrote, that Bob Jessup wrote, that we put on the state there, then take a look at that, and we'll bring them all together as a discussion and say, what do we think are sort of alternatives? How do we build alternatives? Is there something we can say strategically about the state?
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to thank everybody again. I think it's been a very rich and wide-ranging discussion in the short time we've had. Mark wants to say something. You're muted, Mark.
No, I was just clapping. I was just thinking in terms of what Rahila was saying about Rojava. David Graeber did think that was actually a revolution that has occurred. And so I think it's short term to think that things aren't happening. I mean, everybody was surprised by the Seattle World Trade Organization, demonstrations and things since then. And so that's only about 23 years. I think there's hope.
Except that Rojava is very vulnerable currently because Turkey really has been throwing everything at it under cover of what's happening in Gaza, which obviously is a whole lot worse. But they have been attacking all the utilities and so on. Yeah, exactly the same way. So it's
threatened by the state.
Yeah,
I think that we might be shut down soon. I'm not sure because this is not our Zoom, is it? I'm not sure.
I think we can just go on, and once you're now the host, so we can go on a little bit. I mean, obviously,
Okay.
we kind of tell people we were going to end at 9-ish. We always kind of run over a little bit,
Okay.
and if people would like to kind of continue on a little bit more of the discussion for a few more minutes, but I wouldn't run it for another.
So this is the paid version, so it's not going to shut down on us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Well, while we're sort of thinking about any final things, just to alert everybody to the Museum of Care website and the fact that there are rooms there and there's discussions there, apart from this one, which you can see on the calendar. Don't know if everybody's had a look at that, and also the Real Democracy Movement website, which has got a lot of updated quite frequently with new blogs and comments about the present developments, and which I think are obviously there's not word you can describe what's going on now in the world, but very important, huge, enormous changes, and everybody's welcome to contribute to that if they wish to as well. So I don't know, any other little announcements or points here?
Penny wanted to say something.
Sorry, who's that?
Penny?
No, I just wanted to say, make sure you put your email in the chat, and then we can share the chat.
Yeah, and I don't think I need to tell everybody here, but I'm sure everybody's watching all these developments. But the question of democracy and authoritarianism is really the question of the day. I mean, the shutdown of incredible. I just read today that in France, a leading top trade unionist has been arrested for going on a Palestine demonstration, and there's massive arrests going on in Germany of mainly immigrant people just for holding a Palestinian flag. One woman, elderly woman, stood in a square in Germany and was arrested just for saying, I think there should be a ceasefire. So this, the state is rearing its ugly head as we speak. And in this country, it's not a lot better. Okay.
An interesting juxtaposition how we portrayed ourselves as on the side of freedom and human rights and so on in Ukraine, and then in this other conflict, suddenly we're on the other side. These sort of things Russia has done to people over the Ukraine conflict.
Is that Alistair speaking? Can
Yes,
you
sorry,
just say that? So maybe just say that again. I don't know if everybody caught you.
Oh, sorry. When we've seen how Russia has dealt with dissidents over Ukraine, and we've seen them as this illiberal authoritarian regime for doing so, and the West has sort of seen itself as the white knights riding in to help Ukraine, and then suddenly we have another war, and suddenly we seem to be on the side of the oppressor, and we're suddenly shutting everyone down. So it kind of tells the lie, or kind of gives, it kind of shows how much of a lie it is when the state seems to take the side of people rather than it being about power.
Thank you, Alistair. Okay, so I think we'll end there, Michael and Mark and Paul, if that's okay with you and everybody else. Yeah, I mean, CTO has just put into the chat, in Germany, the use of the Palestinian flag was made illegal by the government. So a country that was fairly democratic now having total censorship. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody, and hopefully we'll be in touch and see you in a month's time. And having done all your reading in advance.
Thank you, Corinna.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corinna.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Paul.